admitting the inability to exercise its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, the United Nations Security Council, in a procedural resolution where the veto does not apply, on the 27th of February 2022, decided, I quote, to call an emergency special session of the General Assembly to examine the question of Ukraine, end quote. The supreme irony of this act of the Security Council was that the body to which the Council referred the situation under the Uniting for Peace formula is itself only able to make what are called in the Charter appropriate recommendations to members for collective measures to maintain or restore international peace and security, end quote. This highlights in nuce the ambiguity of the Charter's principle of sovereign equality and exposes a fundamental inconsistency in the organization's rules and procedures. A certain category of members of the supreme executive organ of the United Nations, vested with vast coercive powers to enforce the ban on the use of force, can under no circumstances be legally coerced to abide by the law. For those countries, namely the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, P5, sovereignty appears to be exclusive, in stark contrast to the Charter's principle of sovereign equality of all member states. For the P5, the provisions of the Charter mean sovereignty in the sense of absolutist rule, namely the power to coerce linked with the privilege not to be coerced. In other words, the law cannot be enforced against a permanent member or an ally that enjoys the protection of a permanent member. The stalemate or blockage in the dispute and armed conflict over Ukraine is certainly not the only such situation involving a permanent member of the Security Council. The conflicts over Iraq in 2003 and Palestine since several decades by now, these conflicts were or still are further tragic instances of a paralysis of the world organization. At last year's roundtable consultation in Vienna, the materials of which are now available in print, we came to the conclusion that within the UN system, countries cannot in a consistent manner be held accountable for their international actions. State responsibility has remained a noble principle that will only be invoked when the power constellation allows. And international criminal justice, a system of norms intended to hold leaders to account, can only operate within the arbitrary constraints of politics. Responsibility, whether of states or their leaders, is not linked to accountability. This has profoundly eroded the idea of the international rule of law as advocated by the United Nations. As Hans Kelsen has convincingly argued in his Reine Rechtslehre, Pure Theory of Law, norms without procedures for their enforcement are not norms of law. As an NGO in consultative status with the United Nations, the International Progress Organization has dealt with the dilemma of power and law since our colloquium on Democracy in International Relations, which we held in New York City in October 1985. In this event, which was meant to commemorate the 40th anniversary at that time of the United Nations, we addressed the absence of equality in crucial areas of the UN system. The executive director for the International Year of Peace in that time, 85, Mr. Krzysztof Ostrowski, attended our meeting as special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Also, in the euphoric years immediately after the end of the Cold War, we were co-sponsors of the so-called Camden Initiative, conferences on a more democratic United Nations, of which we convened the second meeting at the UN Center in Vienna in 1991 under the title The United Nations and the New World Order. In spite of increasing global awareness of the problems, not much has changed in terms of substance in the way the United Nations organization operates since we launched those reform proposals. After 3 decades of stalemate in the reform debates, it is, I guess, time to take a fresh look. I'm happy to welcome at our consultation today scholars and practitioners from distant corners of the globe, scholars who are practitioners and practitioners who are scholars, who all have contributed to the discourse on a world order that would be in conformity with equal rights and justice among nations. From the world of politics, we are particularly honored to have among us Mr. Mogens Lykketoft, President of the 70th General Assembly of the United Nations, former Speaker of Denmark's Folketing, the Parliament, and Minister of Foreign Affairs and of Finance in several legislative periods. Opening up the selection process for the post of Secretary General and ensuring a proactive role for the General Assembly on the basis of its revitalization resolution, as it was called, of 2015, Mr. Lykketoft introduced a much-needed element of transparency into the UN system. I also cordially welcome Professor Hassan Diab, who, as President of the Council of Ministers, Prime Minister of Lebanon, head of a government of experts, steered the country through one of its most difficult periods. I also welcome Dr. Karin Kneißl, who, as Foreign Minister, succeeded to initiate a constructive dialogue in relations between Austria and Türkiye, where we meet here today. I also would like to greet from this place Professor Türkaya Ataöv in Ankara, a few hundred kilometers from here. Professor Ataöv, who many consider the doyen of political science and international relations in Türkiye, and who is a recipient of the Golden Honorary Medal of the International Progress Organization, who over several decades has worked with us on the issues that are on our agenda here today. Our organization is deeply indebted to him. We are meeting today at a place of special historic significance, at the gateway between Europe and Asia, inside, if you look out, of one of the iconic bridges that not only facilitate the crossing between the European and Asian districts of the global megalopolis Istanbul has become, but also symbolize the interaction that has existed between East and West since the days of Emperor Darius I, the Great, 2,500 years ago. He ordered the bridging of the Bosphorus by connecting boats, as is famously reported by the Greek historian Herodotus in his Historiae, Book 4. History was written here at Çırağan Saray, where the first parliament of the Ottoman Empire convened on the 14th of November 1909, an event, I would say, that highlighted the transition from absolute to constitutional monarchy. Earlier in the 19th century, the palace was the site of extended power struggles and intrigues. Dethroned Sultan Murad V lived here in this compound for 28 years. In 1878, a failed attempt to liberate him by means of a battleship that was anchored offshore the palace and to reinstate him to the throne cost the lives of most of the plotters. Fast forward to the realpolitik of today, and the significance of the Bosphorus will appear in a new light, if I just may briefly characterize what I mean. In the current situation of regional and geopolitical conflict, the regime of the Straits, which is in place since 1936, has again made us aware of the crucial role of international law. Under the Treaty of Montreux, the Republic of Türkiye has acted as a guardian of the Straits, so to speak, ensuring, I quote from the treaty, that vessels of war belonging to belligerent powers shall not pass through the Straits. That is the provision of Article 19, paragraph 2 of that treaty. In conformity with her rights and obligations under the treaty, Türkiye, on the 27th of February 2022, declared for the purposes of the convention that a state of war, that's the technical term in the treaty, that a state of war existed between Russia and Ukraine. Also, speaking about the history of the place, in the nearby Dolmabahce Palace, Türkiye hosted peace talks not so long ago between Russia and Ukraine, and together with the United Nations brokered the so-called grain deal, Black Sea Grain Initiative, between the warring parties. Türkiye's role also as facilitators a few weeks ago of the largest prisoner exchange since the end of the Cold War between the West and Russia is just, I guess, one indicator of an emerging multipolar constellation at the global level that is substantially different from the multipolarity among the allied powers of the time when the UN was founded. It is to be hoped that the emergence of new global players will give fresh impetus to a comprehensive debate on reform of the international system. A new order must ensure that no one single actor, as powerful as he may be, will be able to block collective action for the maintenance of peace. The protracted armed conflicts in Europe and the Middle East are sad testimony to the predicament of the World Organization under the conditions of what is now an outdated statute, I would say, a statute dictated by a balance of power that vanished long ago. In conclusion, I would like to recall here the words of President Sukarno of Indonesia, who more than 60 years ago anticipated the gist of today's reform debates in a far-reaching speech to the 15th session of the General Assembly of the UN on the 30th of September 1960, he said, and I quote very briefly, "In many ways, the Charter reflects the political and power constellation of the time of its origin. In many ways, that Charter does not reflect the realities of today," end quote. Emphasizing the principle of sovereign equality of states, Sukarno, in this speech, called for major structural reform, and in particular for a redistribution of seats in the Security Council. And that was more than 60 years ago. What was to the point at the height of the Cold War is even more relevant under conditions of today's global realignment, as the late Zbigniew Brzezinski characterized the processes of today. To free the United Nations from the web of power politics, the paralyzing legacy of an earlier era will require participation of all global regions in the organization's decision-making bodies. According to the phrase made popular and eloquently pronounced from the rostrum of the General Assembly by the President of the country we are meeting in today. And that phrase reads simply and briefly, concisely, "The world is bigger than 5." It will be high time for the member states to recommit to fundamental principles and further develop the frameworks of multilateralism. These were the words of Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who now, in those days, this week, suggests in his exposé for a United Nations summit for the future that one has to take up all those basic issues of reform. And that summit for the future, as it is called, will take place in 10 days' time in New York. However, if the states that created the organization in the middle of the last century continue to refuse adaptation of the Charter to the evolving realities of the 21st century, they are putting at risk the very future of their collective effort. This is my caveat concerning that. I thank you for having accepted our invitation to discuss these fundamental concerns of the United Nations organization here in Istanbul, and I look forward to our discussion.